Stick to acting.
Everyone in that room laughed. 2:16 in the morning. He had not forgotten a single measurement.
Sign it.
She did not know what she was signing. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice.
Read the originals.
The man she had just signed out of the building had drawn that engine 11 years before she inherited the company. The transmission had beaten 4 senior engineers over 9 days. It sat dead in the middle of the prototype bay, like something nobody wanted to be caught standing next to, and the endurance qualifier that the entire season hinged on was 61 hours away. Then a man in a black jacket walked in who had not been invited and had no clearance to touch anything. He was listed on the visitor log as a guest of the founder's estate. Nothing more. He crouched beside that gearbox at 2 in the morning, set one hand flat against the casing, the way a person rests a hand, on the shoulder of someone they have known for years, and he had it singing again before sunrise. The next morning, the chief operating officer walked him to the gate and revoked his access for tampering with restricted hardware. What the chief operating officer did not know was that the man in the black jacket had drawn the first sketch of that transmission on the back of a fuel receipt 11 years earlier. Stay with this one, because the person they marched out the door was the reason the building existed at all. His name was Keanu Reeves, and most of the people on the floor knew exactly who he was, which turned out to be the whole problem. They knew the films. They knew the face from the posters and the late-night clips and the magazine covers their teenagers taped to bedroom walls. What they did not know, what almost nobody outside of 2 old men knew, was that long before any of that, before the cameras, there had been a different version of him entirely, and that version had hands that understood metal better than most engineers, understood their own children. Shop was called Wexford Performance Group, and it took up 3 buildings on the south edge of an industrial corridor in Dayton, Ohio, where the river bends and the freight lines still run all night. The late Harlan Wexford had built it out of a single rented garage and a private, almost stubborn belief that American endurance racing did not have to apologize to anyone on the other side of the Atlantic. By the time he died, the company was worth a little over $1 billion, employed 390 people, and held more class titles than Harlan had ever let himself say out loud, because he was the kind of man who thought saying a good thing too early was a way of jinxing it. His daughter, Brielle Wexford, had inherited all of it 14 months ago, 11 days after the funeral, at the age of 29, in a building full of people who went quiet and looked at her whenever a decision needed a face attached to it. She had spent those 14 months learning, mostly, that running a company is not the same as having authority over it, and that the gap between those two things is exactly where other people live. The visitor had arrived 3 months earlier. He had not asked for a role. He had asked, through a letter routed quietly to Brielle's assistant, only for unsupervised access to the lower bay during off hours and a parking spot that nobody would notice. The assistant had flagged it naturally, because a request like that from a man that famous reads like a publicity stunt waiting to detonate. Garrett Pruitt, the chief operating officer, had reviewed the request himself and approved it personally, and had told no one why, and had smiled the entire time he was doing it. So the man came and went. He wore a plain dark jacket and boots that had been resoled at least twice and a watch with a cracked face that he never replaced. He did not hold court. He did not pose for anything. When the younger fabricators recognized him and asked, half laughing, whether he was here researching a role, he would say something like that, in a voice so even and so unbothered that they eventually stopped, asking and started, behind his back, calling him the actor, then just him, then nothing at all, the way you stop noticing a fixture once it has been in the room long enough. A few of them resented him, without quite being able to say why. A man like that, they figured, was playing at their lives the way you play a part. They could not have been more wrong. And the thing about being that wrong is that it costs you nothing right up until the moment it costs you everything. There was one engineer who watched him differently. Her name was Marlo Tate, 26, 3 years out of a doctoral program she had left early because she found the lab too slow and the track honest. She noticed that the famous visitor never looked at the cars the way fans looked at cars. Fans looked at the paint. He looked at the seams. He would stand at the edge of the floor with both hands in his jacket pockets, and his eyes would travel a chassis from the rear bulkhead forward, slow, deliberate. The way a man rereads a letter he wrote a long time ago, and once she watched him close his eyes and lay a palm against a tail section and go completely still. And what crossed his face in that second was not awe. It was something closer to grief and something closer to recognition. And she did not have a word that held both. The failure announced itself on a Tuesday with the sound of Desmond Ackerley, the lead engineer, a 51-year-old with a wall of credentials and 24 years of competition work behind him, sitting down very slowly at his bench and not speaking for the better part of 2 minutes. The Endurance prototype's drive system had developed a fault in the secondary torque transfer sequence that the diagnostic suite kept flagging as physically impossible, given the build configuration, which is the polite way software has of admitting. It has no idea what is wrong. Desmond had 3 days in it. A pair of consultants flown in from a German driveline house had looked at it, spoken to each other in low voices, in a language nobody on the floor could follow, and flown home without leaving a solution behind. Garrett Pruitt called the emergency meeting on Thursday afternoon. His voice in those rooms was always the same, measured, unhurried, carrying a thin and very particular undertone of patience with people who were slower than he was. The options, the way he laid them out, were 2. Withdraw the entry or substitute the backup chassis, which had never run a full distance and everyone in the room knew it. Both cost money. Both cost reputation. The only open question was the ratio. Brielle said neither. She said it quietly, without lifting her voice, the way her father used to close certain conversations by simply removing them from the table. Garrett looked at her 1 beat longer than the moment required, then wrote something small in his notebook, and said nothing, which was its own kind of sentence. The man in the black jacket heard the whole exchange. He was down in the lower bay, on an overturned parts crate, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, looking up at the ventilation grate in the ceiling, the way you look at a radio playing in another room. When the voices above went still, he stayed where he was for a long time. Then he said, to nobody, in a voice barely louder than the building's own hum, "Secondary sun gear. They added a bushing in the 3rd revision that nobody ever drew. They've been chasing a ghost they installed themselves." That night he did not draw anything. He drove back to the small rented unit on the north side where he was staying, a place with almost nothing in it. 2 mugs on the counter, a row of technical manuals where novels would be, and pinned to the wall by the door with a single tack, folded into quarters, a drawing in a fine, deliberate hand that he never explained to anyone because nobody ever came over. He sat at the table with the quiet. He did not fight it and he did not fill it. He had learned a long time ago that the quiet was not empty. It was just waiting to see what you would do with it. At 1:45 in the morning, he drove back to Wexford. His guest credential opened the building because the founder's estate access had never been scoped down to a single floor, and the lower bay had a strip of yellow tape across its mouth and a placard that read "Off-Forest Engineering Only." He stepped over the tape without slowing down. He did not bring unusual tools. He opened a standard kit on the floor and started from the outside in, pulling covers in an order that matched no current procedure anywhere in the company's documentation. Because the current documentation was 3 revisions removed from the logic that had shaped the original design, and he was not working from the documentation. He was working from memory, and not the uncertain memory of a man trying to recall a procedure. The memory of the man who had written it. He found the bushing. It was small and specific, and it appeared on no version of the parts, manifest the company currently kept, because he had added it by hand before the very first endurance test 11 years ago, and had meant to log it formally afterward, and afterward had never come. He pulled it, swapped in a cross-reference component he carried, because he carried things like that, the way other men carry house keys, reassembled the housing in reverse sequence, and ran a manual load check on an analog gauge bolted to the wall that predated the digital rig by more than a decade. And that, he would have bet, not one current engineer on the floor knew how to read. At 12 minutes past 6 in the morning, the drive system turned over and ran clean. The load curve was flat. The variance came in a hair under factory spec, lower than the system had ever recorded in a real test. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, packed the kit, and walked out before the first shift badge tapped through the gate, because the work was the point and being seen doing it was not. Theo Brandt found the trace at 7. He was the workshop foreman, 60 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades lifting things heavier than he would ever admit, and walking them across a floor anyway. He pulled the overnight log, looked at the timestamp, looked at the guest credential attached to it, and then went down to the lower bay and stood there for a long time with an expression Marlowe Tate, watching from across the floor, would later describe as a man, recognizing a handwriting he had not seen in years. Desmond Ackerley ran the full diagnostic at 7:30 and then stood in front of the screen reading it 3 separate times. Every channel was nominal. The torque variance sat lower than the prototype had ever managed in a controlled run. He called 2 of his people over to confirm. He was reading the display correctly. They confirmed it. For a moment, nobody on the engineering team said anything at all, which on that floor, with those people, was close to a religious silence. Garrett Pruitt had been working late on the 4th floor and had watched the whole thing on the security feed. He saw the timestamp, the access entry, the unmistakable figure of the famous visitor, moving through a restricted bay with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been there before, many times before, in another life. Garrett did not go to Brielle that night. He waited until morning. He collected the footage. He organized the access records. He built the file with care, and he left out exactly one thing, which was the diagnostic result. He did not mention that the prototype now ran better than it had ever run. He sat across from Brielle in her office, and he said, "We have an access control problem. An individual without engineering clearance entered a restricted bay and performed an unsupervised intervention on our single, most critical asset with no oversight of any kind." Brielle watched the footage. The timestamp read 2:16 in the morning. The figure on the screen moved through the bay with no hesitation, no confusion, none of the tentative quality of a person doing something for the first time. "Does it run?" she asked. "That isn't the question," Garrett said. "I'm asking it anyway." Garrett squared the edge of his folder against the desk. "The question is precedent. We are still inside the review window from the Callaway recall. Any undocumented technical intervention, regardless of outcome, is liability exposure this company cannot absorb right now. It does not matter whose face is attached to it. If anything, the face makes it worse." Brielle was quiet. 14 months ago, she would have signed whatever he slid across the desk and felt relieved to have it decided for her. She was learning slowly when not to do that, but she did not yet know what she was missing, and Garrett was not technically wrong about the review window, and a person can be steered a long way on the strength of a thing that is technically not wrong. She signed the access revocation. The visitor came to her office in the dark jacket and the Reeves boots. He did not sit. When he stepped through the door, his eyes moved across the room once fast, a habit so quick it was nearly invisible, and stopped for a fraction of a second on the large photograph mounted on the wall to the left. A championship-winning car in victory lane, confetti suspended in the air. The crew packed around it, grinning. In the lower corner of that original print, almost too small to see from where he stood, was a mark 2 letters and a year, in the same fine and deliberate hand that had filled the drawing pinned to the wall of his rented unit. Brielle set a tablet on the desk with the footage, paused on it. "Can you explain this?" "I fixed it," he said. "You weren't cleared to. It runs now." "That isn't what I asked you." Garrett was standing at Brielle's left. His voice, when it came, was smooth and level and faintly amused. "Do you have any idea what that asset is worth? Do you hold a single engineering certification relevant to that system? What exactly qualified you to put your hands inside it?" The visitor did not look at Garrett. He kept his eyes on Brielle. "Do you want the car to run this weekend?" he said. "Or do you want the paperwork to be tidy?" The question sat in the room. It was not rude and it was not defiant. It was just the cleanest possible translation of the choice she was actually being asked to make. And it was the kind of question that had exactly one honest answer. And that honest answer would have required her to explain why she was revoking his access anyway. Brielle looked down at the desk. Garrett rested one hand lightly on the back of her chair, barely a touch, barely visible, and she looked back up. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your conduct fell outside the scope of your access and our safety protocol. We're ending your arrangement here, effective today." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he zipped the dark jacket to the collar, slowly, without hurry, and looked at her one last time. "Before you run the car this weekend," he said, his voice carrying nothing heavier than a suggestion, "find the original design set for that drive system. Not the current revision, the original, if this company still has it." Then he walked out. Garrett watched the door close. His hand, which had been resting on the back of Brielle's the chair, pressed down once into the fabric briefly before he lifted it away. Below the window, through 4 floors of glass and steel, the prototype sat in its bay with a drive system that ran exactly the way it had been built to run, 11 years and 3 revisions ago, by a man who had just been escorted off the property. Brielle stood at the window for a long time after he left. She told herself she was thinking about liability. She was actually thinking about the word he had set down so carefully on his way out, the original, and the particular weight he had put on it. The way a person leans on a word that holds more history than the word can carry by itself. The qualifier came and went. The prototype ran every lap of it clean and finished third, Wexford's strongest result in 7 years. The crew was loud. The engineers were jubilant. Numbers were revised upward, and projections were rewritten. And somebody opened something that had been saved for a long time. Brielle stood at the edge of the pit lane in the noise and the light, and felt almost none of it land. She had one hand in her jacket pocket, resting on her phone, and she was thinking about a document she had not yet looked for. Monday morning, she went down to find Theo Brandt. He was in the lower bay, eating lunch alone, sitting on the same overturned crate the visitor used to sit on, looking out at the floor with the particular stillness of a man who has watched the same view for so long, that he is no longer certain whether he is watching it or waiting for something to walk into it. "Did you know who he was?" Brielle said. No greeting. "Theo was a man you got to the point with." He chewed slowly, set the sandwich down on its wrapper, and folded his hands. "I knew the 3rd time I watched him stand at the edge of that floor. Maybe the 2nd. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because he didn't want me to, and because that was his to decide and not mine." He looked at her then, the look of a man who has carried a silence for a long time, and is now choosing, on purpose, to set it down. "But I'll tell you the rest of it now, since you came down here and asked. And since it's past the point where any of it can be taken back." Brielle sat on a stool near him. 12 years ago, Theo said, your father took a chance on somebody with no degree and no credentials, and a problem solved on the back of a fuel receipt. He found him through a forum, one of those small communities of self-taught builders who post problems and solutions late at night for the pure pleasure of it. Nobody's name attached, nobody asking for anything. Your father said it was the cleanest load path solution he had ever seen, and that the person who posted it didn't seem to know it was supposed to be hard. Theo paused. The person was the man in the dark jacket. This was a long time before the films. He came here, And across 3 years, he designed 5 drive systems for this company. The endurance unit, the one in that prototype right now, was the last one. It was the best thing he ever built. Brielle's hands were still in her lap. What happened to him? His older brother died. Long illness, the kind that takes a year and takes it slowly. The two of them had no one else. Theo did not soften his voice around the fact. He stated it the way a man states a structural truth, because sentiment would only weaken it. He stayed to the end of that, and then he walked out of here and didn't come back. Left everything on the bench. Nobody chased him very hard. Your father was already getting sick. The company was halfway through a transition, and there was a great deal of confusion about a great many things that year. Then the films happened, somewhere else, in another part of his life entirely, and the world only ever met that version of him. And the version that built half the trophies in our lobby just quietly stopped existing, as far as anyone here knew, and the original drawings. The original set, the handwritten one with his mark in the corner, was on his bench the day he left. By the time anyone got around to organizing the handover paperwork, it was gone. Theo did not say Garrett's name. He did not have to. The direction of the thing was as plain as a shaft running true in its bearings. Brielle sat with that. The lower bay smelled of cut metal and oil, and the particular staleness of a room whose ventilation had never quite kept pace with the work done in it. He came back, she said. Not a question. He came back because of the car. The endurance unit has a change in the secondary stage, a bushing he added by hand before the first long run, and never formally logged. Without somebody who knows it's in there, the system runs fine for years. Then a third revision adds something on top of it that should never have gone in. And the whole thing starts hunting a fault that doesn't exist anywhere it's looking. He heard somehow that the car was struggling. So he came back. No name anyone would put on a badge. No claim on anything. Just close enough to fix it when it finally broke. The way you'd drive a long way to sit in a hospital hallway for somebody. Not to be seen doing it, just so you'd be there. Brielle was quiet for a long time. He wrote to my father. He did. Your father told me, 3 months before the end. A letter had come, and he was going to answer it, and he kept setting it aside because he didn't know how to say the thing that needed saying, and he was running out of strength to say hard things. Theo's expression did not change, but something behind it acknowledged a grief Brielle was not showing on her own face. He never got to it. I'm sorry. Brielle went back upstairs and did not take off her jacket. Then she stood up and went to the records room, on the 3rd floor, a space most of the current staff did not know existed, lined with flat files and document boxes, and the accumulated paper history of a company that had once been small enough to keep all of itself in one room. She found the storage unit, registered under her father's personal records. The lock was a 6-digit combination, her mother's birthday, because Harlan Wexford used the same combination for everything, and had never once worried whether that was wise. Inside were contracts, correspondence, and near the bottom of the last drawer, a flat envelope sealed with tape that had gone yellow at the edges. The return mark read only KR. The postmark was 3 months before her father died. She opened it. One folded page, a clear and direct hand, no flourish anywhere in it. I heard you're not well. I'm not asking you to write back. I'm not asking for anything. But if Brielle ever needs someone who understands that drive system from the foundation up, I still remember every measurement. I'm not after credit. I only want to know the car is safe, because the driver trusts it more than the driver knows, and that trust should be earned by the people who can't be seen, not spent by the ones who can. KR. Brielle sat down on the floor of the records room, with her back against the shelf and the page in her hands. Her father used to say, when she was young and impatient with detail, that the difference between a good car and a great one was never in the metal. It was in whether the person who built it was listening while they built it. She had never understood that. She was beginning to. She photographed the original drive system set, the handwritten one her father had locked away separately, the one with the fine notations in the lower margin and the 2-letter mark in the corner, and she laid it beside the current engineering files. The change Theo had described was there in the original and absent from every revision after it. 3 teams of engineers across a decade had worked off the simplified copy, and none of them had ever known there was a deeper document underneath it. Garrett had known. He had known because he was the one who lifted the original off the bench and submitted the design to the board, with the attribution stripped out of it. He had known because he had watched the simplified version propagate through the company for years and never once corrected it. And he had known the moment the famous visitor's quiet request crossed his desk 3 months ago, exactly whose hands he was inviting back into the building, which was why he had approved it personally and smiled the whole time. Because a guest with no title and no standing is a thing you can remove on any convenient morning, and a man you can remove is a man you do not have to credit. What Garrett had not calculated was that Brielle Wexford would go looking for something nobody had looked for in 10 years. She called him to her office the next afternoon. She did not route it through his assistant. She sent the message herself to his phone, directly, and when he arrived she was at the window with her back to him and 3 items laid out on the desk. He looked at them. He did not sit down. The first was the original handwritten drive system set, the notation in the lower margin, the initials in the corner. The second was a chain of internal correspondence from 10 years prior, authored by Garrett, submitted to the board, attributing the endurance design to the engineering department as a collective. The third was a paper fuel receipt, gone soft and yellow with handling, a load path sketch in pencil across the back of it, and the same 2-letter mark. Theo Brandt had carried it in his wallet for a decade. In the uncelebrated and total way, certain men hold on to proof of a thing that should never have been allowed to disappear. The licensing arrangement with the German group, Brielle said, still at the window, is dead. The intellectual property in that drive system cannot be licensed by this company because the original authorship was never formally assigned. The author never signed a transfer because no one ever put one in front of him, because no one ever admitted the original document existed. You have 48 hours with legal counsel. Garrett's voice when it came was even. He abandoned the work. He walked out. This company developed it, refined it, manufactured it, sold it, and won with it. For 11 years. He walked out because his brother was dying, and he had nobody else, and he chose a year of hospital hallways over a drawing. Her voice did not climb. It settled, the way her father's voice used to settle when he had finished deciding a thing. And he came back without asking for 1 cent or 1 line of credit to fix the fault that was going to put our driver into a wall at speed. Our driver is 24 years old. His name is Cole Pemberton, and you have walked past him in that pit lane every weekend for 2 years. I'm not having this conversation any further. Garrett left. He did not say another word, and the door closed behind him with the specific quiet of a man who has run his remaining options and found the total insufficient. What followed for Garrett Pruitt was not loud, and that was its particular cruelty. The board met. The original correspondence was read aloud, his name on every line of it. He was removed from his role within the week, not with an announcement but with the absence of one. His name simply gone from the directory, the way the original drawings had gone from the bench, and he learned what that erasure felt like from the inside. The intellectual property concealment surfaced a clause in his own compensation agreement, the kind a man writes carefully into his own contract and never expects to be read against him. His deferred equity was held back pending review, and then when the review closed, not released. The German group, on learning the authorship history, did not merely walk away from the deal. They circulated, quietly, within the small and unforgiving world of people who build these systems, the reasons they had walked. Garrett Pruitt spent 30 years becoming a man whose name opened doors in that world, and he spent the following 18 months discovering that it now closed them, and that the people closing them would not tell him why to his face. Because he had taught a whole industry, by example, how that was done. He requested one meeting with Brielle near the end of it. He did not ask for the equity. He had stopped expecting that. He sat across the desk, where he had once slid folders, and for a long time he did not speak. And when he did, his voice did not have the old undertone in it anymore. I told myself, he said, for 10 years, that I was protecting the company, that a man who walks out forfeits his name, that keeping the drawings was custody, not theft. He looked at his own hands on the desk. I rehearsed that until I believed it. I needed to believe it, because the alternative was that I had taken the best thing another person ever made and put my department's name on it, and then arranged to have him carried out the door the day he came back, so I would never have to hear him say so. He was quiet for a moment. It was the second one. It was always the second one. I knew it the morning I approved his request and smiled doing it. A man who is protecting something doesn't smile like that. He did not ask her to forgive it. He had finally understood that asking would have been one more thing taken. He stood and he left. And that was the last conversation he had inside that building. Brielle drove to the small rented unit. On the north side the following morning she rang the bell. The door opened on a man in a plain dark t-shirt, with a rag over one shoulder and grease worked into the lines of his hands, and behind him on the floor of the front room, a motorcycle engine sat in pieces, laid out in an order so precise, it looked less like a tear-down than a sentence. Somebody was in the middle of writing. "You found it," he said. He was not surprised. He stepped back to let her in. She put the page on the table between them. The letter, the one addressed to her father, the one that had never been answered. He looked at it for a long moment without picking it up. Then he did, and he held it, the way a person holds a thing that has weight past its physical weight. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "When I revoked your access. When you were standing in my office. You knew. Why didn't you just tell me?" "I didn't come back to take anything," he said. "I came back because the car needed someone who understood the design from the foundation. That's the whole of it. If I'd put the rest on the table, you'd have had to weigh the name instead of the work. And the name was never the point. The bushing was the point. The driver was the point. That's all," she repeated, very quietly, and the words did not fit the size of the thing she was holding. "The drive system has a failure mode. Your current team can't diagnose from the documentation they have," he said. Not because they aren't good. They're good. Because the documentation is incomplete. And that isn't their fault. Run it enough seasons without somebody who knows the second stage sequence, and it lets go at speed. Not in the pit. At speed, your driver is 24. "Cole," she said. "Cole," he confirmed, as if the name were the entire argument, and it was. She sat down at his table without being asked, and without apologizing for it. A moment passed. "Garrett took your drawings. I know. Did you know that when you came back?" He was quiet a moment. "I suspected it. I didn't come back for him. I want to be clear about that, because it matters how this gets remembered. I didn't come back to watch him fall. I came back for the bushing. What happened to him, he built. Every part of it. I just declined to be the thing that kept it from arriving." She looked at him across the small table. This careful, quiet man who had stood in her building for 3 months with no title, who had solved a billion-dollar fault with a part the size of a thumbnail and walked out before the first shift could see him do it, who had been removed with a form sentence and had said on his way out only that she should read the original documents. And she thought about what it had meant to stand in a company full of people looking for credit, while exactly one person stood at the edge of the floor, looking at the car. "I'd like you to come back," she said. "Not as a guest on the visitor log, as what you are." She set a folder on the table and slid it across. He opened it and read it from the first line to the last, with the patience of a man who does not sign anything he has not finished understanding. She watched him do it. He was thorough and unhurried, and she recognized the quality, because she had seen it in her father, reading contracts, the way a careful person treats language, exactly the way a careful person treats a torque spec, as a thing that does not forgive being approximated. "The clause on personal history," he said. "I decide what's public. You don't put me in front of a camera or a board or a release without my word, in writing, first. You decide all of it, she said. But I can't take your name off the drawings. It was always there. It should always have been there. The most I can do is make sure it never comes off again. He was quiet for a moment. He knew I'd come back, didn't he, your father? Brielle held his gaze. He knew a great many things he ran out of time to explain to me. I'm still finding them. I think that letter was him trying to start, and not knowing how, and that's the part I have to live with. You should know he never read it as a man asking for credit. He read it as the only person in his company who was still listening, telling him the car wasn't safe. He told Theo it was the truest thing anyone had said to him in a year. He picked up the pen from the inner pocket of the folder and signed on the line, and the signature was the same two initials in the same hand, at the same slight angle as the mark in the lower corner of the original drawings, the quiet certainty of a person who has known exactly who he is for a long time and was only ever waiting for a moment when it cost nothing to say so. He set the pen down. One condition, he said. It doesn't go in the contract. She waited. Cole gets a full technical briefing before his next race. Not the maintenance protocol. The original design logic. The why of every part of it. He's the one strapped into it at 200 miles an hour. He has the right to know what he's trusting. Done, she said without a pause. He came in the next morning at 7:45, not through the lower bay, through the main entrance, where the receptionist said good morning, and used his name and got it right, and the badge clipped to his shirt read, a title that had been true for 11 years, and was only now, finally printed where anyone could see it. Theo Brandt was waiting at the workshop door with 2 cups of coffee, holding one out without a word. He took it. Desmond Ackerley crossed the floor inside of 2 minutes, already talking. The genuine urgency of a serious engineer who has just discovered that the foundation under his understanding of a system runs deeper and stranger, and more elegant than he ever knew, was down there. I read the original set last night, he said. All of it, cover to cover, twice. I have 19 questions, and the first one is keeping me up. He looked at Desmond, and at the urgency in him, and felt something settle in his own chest that had been unsettled for a long time, longer than this building knew. I've got all day, he said. On the 4th floor, Brielle stood at her window and watched them below, the 2 of them, side by side near the prototype. A fresh set of drawings spread between them, both men leaning over the paper in the posture of people building rather than the posture of people defending. Across the floor, Marlowe Toad had pulled a stool to the edge of the group without being invited, the way she had once watched him from across the room, except she was inside the circle of it now. Her phone buzzed against the desk. A message from a representative of one of the largest endurance organizations on the continent. They had studied the prototype's performance data from the qualifier. About a technical partnership. They would like to meet her design team at her earliest convenience. She typed the reply herself. We'd be glad to. Our design team is in the middle of being put right. Give us a little time to get properly oriented. She sent it, set the phone face down, and turned back to the glass. Below, the floor was alive with its ordinary noise. The press of metal, the high, clean tone of an alignment tool, the low pulse of something being tested and corrected and tested again. And beneath all of it, if you were standing in exactly the right place, and you were the kind of person who had learned to listen not for what was loudest but for what was true, the sound of that drive system running exactly the way it had been designed to run, 11 years after it was built, finally back in the hands of the only person who knew every note of it by heart, and the lesson in it, the one nobody on that floor said out loud, because the best lessons are the ones a story declines to explain. Was this, the people who keep a thing running are almost never the people. Standing where the light is, and a company or a person, is measured most honestly, not by the names it puts on the trophies, but by whether it can still hear the quiet ones who are only ever asking whether the car is safe.